I actually changed the date today. This was created sometime in November and just updated recently. Yeah, and it was kind of trying to figure out also and to explain better what Cluster API actually is and why we're thinking about it much more nowadays and actually doing some efforts and what those efforts actually even are. As you were talking about, or it seemed that we have disparate understandings of what and how and why and where and what it even is. So that's it. Ask questions whenever you want. Yeah. So what is it? First and importantly, I hope if you have any issues with tech or I have any issues with tech, please tell me. Yeah, and it's not just an API. It sounds like, yeah, it's an API, but it's not just an API. And it's kind of two things when we talk about it. And the first thing that most of you might have understand from that is that it's an API. It's basically the upstream consensus to a declarative way to create and manage Kubernetes clusters. The discussion started on KubeCon Copenhagen. That is quite a long time ago. We were also involved from back then. And like back then you could understand it as like upstream giant swarm kind of like, yeah, the thing that we built for like in the beginning then suddenly made more sense also to upstream. So they started working on that. And then the other side of Cluster API, which isn't in the name, is it's also an upstream effort by many companies by now. I think 30, 40 companies involved by now to have reference implementations, or what started out as reference implementations of these controllers, but is becoming kind of the consensus implementation of, for example, certain providers of how Kubernetes should run. But we talk about that in detail in a bit. So it's not just the API, it's also the implementation, the code side. And together that makes an operator. So it's the one side is the cluster types, the CRDs, and the other side is the controllers, and together it makes what we usually call an operator. And so let's look at these two things kind of separately, because we've also worked on them separately. We've been focusing on the API very early on. And what is the API in Cluster API? It's, as I said, a set of custom resource definitions that define a Kubernetes cluster. And on top of that, a unified way to extend these CRDs. In the beginning, it was actually extending the actual custom resource, and it has turned into having additional custom resources for the provider parts. And the latest release is V1 Alpha 4, so it's still in Alpha. And Alpha 4 is just out. I think none of the upstream providers do Alpha 4 yet, as far as I've seen. That might change.
CRDs in detail for non-techies?
Sure, I can try. So how I usually explain it is that Kubernetes has this thing called resources. A pod is a resource, a volume is a resource, a service is a resource. That's how you define a desire in Kubernetes. And then once you have that desire defined, then Kubernetes has controllers that go and say, hey, this person wants a pod with a certain container. I'm going to make that happen. I'm going to fulfill that wish. And those, like the YAML files, the manifests that our customers and users do apply to a Kubernetes cluster, those are resources. And custom resources are the custom version of those resources. So if you want to define a new type of resource in a cluster, in this case, you want to define what a cluster actually even is. You can create a custom resource. The joke of it, or the thing that a lot of people show about it, is like you could teach a Kubernetes cluster to understand what a pizza is, right? The pizza operator, or Cruster API I saw yesterday. It's a Domino's implementation, so it's extending the Kubernetes API, as Timo just I think said in the chat. So that is, and it's only the API. So creating a CRD means
if you eat the pizza, would the operator order another one? When does it stop?
Yeah, maybe
the
pizza operator is a very bad example of reconciliation in action, because you're gonna have pizza all the time. You have to cancel your pizza again. It's maybe a job that you need to run. Does it explain it a bit better? The custom resource, and the custom resource alone is only there to define something. Just the custom resource doesn't do a thing. So you could use basically Kubernetes as a database of things just by creating a lot of custom resources. You don't need to even use them. And we've been doing that in some parts of Giant Swarm system, like with the app catalog entries, for example. They're currently a representation of some things that we're not actually using in code right now, but we are planning to use. So custom resource is only that. And this is why it's only an interface, an API. Okay. Now to why we should use it, or the reasons why people should use it. For us, there is some benefits in having this consensus API. It means that hopefully at some point there will be tooling that works against all providers and companies. There is one of those tools already called cluster-CTL, and not many more, but if this API is basically the standard, then we would hopefully see more tools being implemented against it and having like first-class support for it. And then there is this lower risk of having the not invented here syndrome, doing things a giant swarm way, and having a reassurance that we're doing things in a way, or defining things here as it's an API, in a more native and consensus way that more people have looked at and deem that it makes sense. And it is the basis of future upstream efforts. You can already see that pretty much a lot of the multi-cluster use cases are already planned based on cluster API, and you could think about other interfaces like cluster registries being there for federation or multi-cluster use cases, all agreeing that, okay, now that we defined this consensus API, let's use it in all parts of the system. You could see a similar thing where people were working on kubeadm, and then kubeadm became kind of one of the consensus tools that is used by a lot of distributions and a lot of different places inside of Kubernetes as a project and as an ecosystem. For customers, there is a bit of a lower lock-in, as like if they work against an API that is consensus, you could theoretically say, okay, I can create the same cluster also against another provider that has also cluster API. If those providers will expose the cluster API, that is, we don't know that. And there is the benefit of that standard tooling and those standard extension use cases coming in the future. Maybe there will be, I don't know, a Terraform plugin or Helm charts or some better integration into CI/CD tools or with Flux. So that those would be interesting to customers. But to sum it up, currently the benefits are still not huge, right? and it is still alpha. So that is maybe also why not a lot of people are like creating tons of tools for it, because it might change. Alpha says in the definition of it that the API might still change. Although from 3 to 4, the changes were smaller and we're seeing it stabilize. And our belief currently, at least quite strongly, is going to be the standard. I don't have a slide about everyone who is involved, but do look at Marcel's talk about Cluster API if you're interested there also. It goes into much more detail. Status, where are we regarding API? The first place where we started with implementing the API was AWS. The Firecracker team implemented V1 Alpha 2, and it was quite an effort. And as V1 Alpha 2 sadly is quite different from Alpha 3 and 4, there will be considerable effort there to move forward. Celestial, as the Azure team, came next and had the luxury of already having Alpha 3, although that was also quite a lot of work. And what they're doing, at least as far as I saw, they're continuously trying to keep that in sync. I don't think we are on Alpha 4 there, but we need to evaluate how much work that is and when and how to do this. On KVM, we are not on KVM Cluster API. We're using our legacy API. We have not done anything there in that direction besides some investigation and having some issues around it. Team Rocket, as finally having a team in Team Rocket, basically for this, we can think about this more deeply. We do want to move there because the Cluster API is kind of also how we want to replace our legacy API and get rid of those legacy services. So it's something that we do want to do, but we still need to evaluate how and where. And there's also the question of like, what's this VMware and on-premise that we are evaluating. And I can talk about that a bit more when we talk about the controller side of things. But it is kind of our status on the API side. Controllers. Controllers is kind of the really interesting part, and where it also gets quite complex in Cluster API, because upstream calls them provider implementations mainly, and they are kind of split into. And this is a simplification. There is other types or other controllers still involved, but you can roughly think about there's infrastructure providers and there's Bootstrap providers. There's also some controllers that are completely shared between no matter which Bootstrap or infrastructure provider you're using. Basically provider in the sense means there is on the infrastructure side, it is towards a single infrastructure type. So it is AWS or it is Azure, it's OpenStack or Alibaba, or there's one provider called SSH, I think, that is more agnostic. And on the Bootstrap side, it is what is used for the control plane of Kubernetes mainly. But we can talk about that in detail in a bit. Infrastructure providers. So each provider comes as a set of controllers. So it's unlike Giant Swarm, where we have a more like packaged operator. That there the controllers are a bit more separate. And the architecture again, there is Marcel's slide that explained the architecture really well. I saw them yesterday. And yeah, basically these infrastructure or these providers are provided by companies, by these infrastructure companies themselves. but oftentimes also by community people, or additionally by community people, and by other companies. For example, and that's the point down there is that VMware, as the cluster API effort, like was in a big part driven by Heptio, which got bought by VMware, and is still very much driven by VMware. VMware has put a lot of effort also into AWS and Azure providers. They were actually the first who started working on them, and the Azure team, for example, only came in after VMware had started things. And when the cloud has different options for running clusters, there's oftentimes also different options. I give here the example of EC2 for control planes versus EKS, but I actually saw, I don't know, yesterday or sometime, that EKS is actually a Bootstrap provider option. So that's in the wrong place here. But that's details. That's not that important. But it's interesting to see that, yeah, EKS is also an option that is thought about in cluster API. And what we saw very early on is that Microsoft basically put a full team on working on cluster API Azure, CAPI as and is planning to use it actually also as a basis for AKS internally. And I know also now from last KubeCon that Google uses cluster API inside of Anthos, at least for spawning clusters on not Google clouds and infrastructures. CAPI stands for Cluster API Provider Azure.
By the way, we talked to AWS yesterday, and they confirmed that EKS Anywhere is going to be built on top of Cluster API as well.
I knew it. Yeah, cool. That is a really cool thing too. So we are seeing that basically at least the hyperscalers are going towards it, and there's a slide in Marcel's slide that shows the whole picture of like all the providers that are at least have been started, and there's OpenStack in there, and then Ali Cloud and Cisco Cloud and what have you. So it's worked on by many companies and providers, but it is still in early development phases for a lot of providers, and even those that are a bit further. I mean, it's still they count themselves as alpha, and they treat the software similarly. They do have some expectations and higher goals sometimes, also as cluster APIs internally used in the VMware Tanzu product, for example, which is GA. So they have other kind of goals with that too. Bootstrap providers. A little bit I already talked about. The first implementation of Bootstrap providers, and the one that is still mainly used, is based on kubeadm. Also because a lot of people from VMware and Heptio worked on kubeadm and pushed it. It was Joe Bida's project. They also, and it is basically the de facto standard currently to Bootstrap Kubernetes. They moved it over also into Cluster API, and in Cluster API, actually, some of the things that were not so interesting for us in kubeadm at being generating stuff have been like more declarative, or moved to a more declarative way in Cluster API. And it is quite stable and offers a good feature set. It's actually like quite far on the security side. In some places, maybe further than we are. In others, like pod security policies, they don't enforce that. But that's easy to add. Yeah, and this is basically it's. There is ways to extend that, both with an ignition wrapper. It's also the proposals how to do a more extendable Bootstrap, which is cloud inits or ignitions or other ways of extending it. And as it is already, it felt quite configurable, at least when I tried it. At least the Kubernetes itself is quite configurable. but you need to know what to do. Some things are not directly openly documented, and yeah, it's not trivial. And again, the why slide. Here, benefits are a little bit, I would say, different in ways of, like, if you look, for example, at the ludicrous backlog, there's quite a few items, especially the security items, that would be irrelevant with kubeadm, or would at least be different, and there would be some upstream efforts towards those already. And it would mean that if we basically have not only the Bootstrap side, but also the other controllers, if we use more from upstream, then we have less overhead building our Kubernetes distribution, right? And building all the features that basically everyone else also has, right? Which COPS had and everyone else also had, and then we had to also build them. And hopefully this gives us more time to focus on the more differentiating features, the ones that that are actually on top of what everyone else has. And sometimes it's also and you see that when we run software from other providers, from other vendors, there is sometimes this excuse that, okay, this feature, this is exactly how upstream or the cloud has intended it. And this is sometimes an excuse, like when we talk about Spot instances, it's exactly how AWS wants to use Spot instances. That's how we implemented it. Sure, it could be nicer, but it's not that it's like we did something to make it worse. Right, and then it goes back to the point before that, okay, yeah, when we then see that there is a feature that upstream doesn't want to support, but our customers very clearly would like it, and it kind of makes sense, like a better Spot, then we can think about, okay, maybe we can build that. And we either build it for us, or we even build this for the whole community, which is then also an interesting thing to think about. Like, for example, like, what do we do about updates? Fernando and we talked about that. Like, could we have some of that, what we want to do, also provided for anything that is Cluster API? And also quite importantly is there is an option to offer a giant swarm on other providers. And, many of you have most probably heard that, like, there is sometimes customers asking us, or potential customers asking us, could we run on Google Cloud? Could we run on OpenStack? Could we run on I don't know what? And sadly, we don't have time to build those things usually. Yeah, so that is an option at least. And we need to see how much time we actually would gain from that. On the customer side, there's also quite some benefits, and they're also usually quite mid to long term. I think there will be a direct benefit, other than, like, yes, being closer to upstream and having a lower lock-in, or like at least a lower perceived lock-in, is quite interesting, and benefiting from basically the whole marketing that VMware does. Gives people, like, or companies, this feeling of, yeah, Cluster API makes sense. They do convince a lot of companies that way, and us being kind of the nice managed option for Cluster API could be quite a selling point for customers. Yeah, definitely the more providers, or the provider options could be very interesting to customers, and also kind of for us, or for us in product. I think it's interesting to think about mid to long term being able to deliver more features, both features that upstream builds, but also features that we can build on top of, with our experience. And they are quite early. Everything, like, especially the infrastructure providers, are quite early sometimes, but they are catching up fast. They are supported and worked on by the actual people who own that infrastructure by now. And we need to see that we don't miss the trend there. And this is still not like a thing is like let everything go and deprecate all the things and just use something else. This is not what I'm saying here. But yeah, let's look at our status. And this is very simplified, and it's much more nuanced maybe. But we had at least the feeling that, for example, on AWS, our implementation is still superior, whatever that means. I called it like that once to upstream in some places, and we need to really evaluate. And we have like a lot of production running on it, right? So the switch is not trivial there. On Azure, we are. I said we're not too far apart. It's still not that we are super close, but at least it looks like we are closer to being able to do parts of a switch to upstream controllers there. And it feels also like it could be a good first candidate to work on. On-premise, the question is a bit different also, because we are, with the new team, we're also trying to think about, is KVM even a long-term thing that we want to do? Could it be replaced by VMware provider and maybe even, I know, some other bare metal providers that are coming up? So this is still a bit more open. But this is these are all kind of things that we're still talking and thinking about, and that are not set in stone. Yeah, and yeah, for the type of KVM that we do, there is no upstream. Right? So there is no way to just say, hey, we throw away KVM and put in something else that works exactly like that for our customers. That's not an option there. Yeah, I put in KDES Cloud Config separately, as it's kind of also a different team. As Ludacris is, and KDES Cloud Config, for those that don't know, this is where we keep like our provider independent or partly independent part of Kubernetes, where we keep our distribution of Kubernetes. It's both the setup of the OS, but also the bootstrap of Kubernetes. And there we are strongly evaluating if we could re-implement that, what we have right now. And we don't want to get rid of all the fixes and tweaks that we did over the years, right? We did some very good things there. But yeah, how we could, for example, use a bootstrap provider like the Kube one, or something that is more upstream, to replace parts of that. But first, what we're looking into, or mainly Marcel has been working on quite a lot, is to see, to try the waters out in adopting the generic controllers, those that are common around all providers and all bootstraps, to also figure out some of the issues that we have, for example, with versioning, that are not directly like that understood or wanted by upstream. So we're making the steps, and we're on a good way there. But yeah, this is also still like not 100% thing where we're like, yeah, we can definitely do this, and it's going to be done in like a month or so. So what now? We do, as a recap, we do believe that Cluster API is the future of upstream and of Giant Swarm. I think we have a consensus, and even on the both on the product side, but also on the engineering side, that this stuff is making more and more sense. And the fact is that we are currently using a lot of resources just building things that are not differentiating us. at least in the eyes of a lot of potential customers, but as some of you have maybe also gotten to know, also some current customers don't see where the Kubernetes is different anymore, or don't feel that differentiation on the Kubernetes product side, right? So it's not, they still see the services and stuff, and service and product are very bound at Giant Swarm. So it's not that we can just, and that's why we don't say, yeah, bring your own Kubernetes and we just give you the same service. That's not what we do. And we are like, it's just not that we not just that we need to make the first steps. We are making the first steps, and we're hitting a lot of challenges, but it feels still very optimistic, and it feels like we're doing good and making good steps towards it, and kind of Ludicrous as the team who's basically doing the more generic and core Kubernetes moves, and Celestial as the team that is has a bit more breathing space towards and has a bit of a step already done towards these newer cluster API types. Feel like a good spearhead that maybe could make a first move, but we're also talking about the exact things that we want to do and the exact kind of steps that we can go in the workgroup cluster API. And then it's basically up to also all of you. What do you think? Right? This is not a thing where we're like from any point in the company saying like this is completely set in stone. What do you think about this?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Is it possible right now, with the state of the reference implementations, or however they are called, of all the controllers, to, for example, take cluster API tooling and create clusters, maybe a management cluster, and then workload clusters on, for example, Google Cloud?
I'm not sure about the status of Google. I myself have tried it on AWS, and it was very easy. And you could very quickly run and get a clean cluster up that is working. A lot of the other providers are also. Christian, you want to say something? You tried Google. I remember something there.
I tried Google, but not with Cluster API. I think there is a very recent release, like a couple of weeks ago, of the first infrastructure controller for Google, but I didn't try it, so I'm not sure.
And Google having GKE is kind of the provider where maybe GKE makes sense also as without cluster API there, or without having the direct controllers there.
At least there is a release of a Google provider. It's like 2 months old or so. So it should be, there should be something. You, of course, need to investigate the quality of it.
Yeah.
But
the maturity of what gets out of it is diverse, let's say.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is contributing to that should be definitely much easier than doing it from scratch on our own. Also, on our own.
Yeah, thanks for your question. From my side, so what I understand pretty much why it is the future, because everybody agrees on, and obviously when it becomes a standard, still pretty rough, I guess, to understand what the potential timeline looks like, that it becomes the future. I also understand that whatever, there are many people already working like whatever since a year, 2 years on it, and might take another year or two. My question here is like really how do we still wait on CAPI implementation? Do we start launching other Kubernetes distros like EKS, AKS before? How is then in the independency, like kind of how is that related?
at least the feeling is that on our providers, making a move this year is makes sense, and having, like, for example, the option of EKS is already provided in Cluster API. So, like, instead of building the option for our current system, it could make sense to, or it feels like it does make sense currently, to me at least. I haven't like extremely researched this, that to rather than go for the Cluster API one and get the EKS one for free, instead of like putting time into that and then having to throw that also out, for both out basically, in favor of the future Cluster API implementation. At least kind of VMware, AWS, and Azure are also the ones that are mainly pushed by VMware themselves. And they're selling it as GA in form of Tanzu, so can't be that bad. That's they abstract it away. Right?
Yeah.
They don't expose the API, they don't expose anything inside of Tanzu, as far as I've heard and seen.
But I also understand that this is a way forward, but we still don't have any kind of time in our mind when that could be possible to launch. And like, if I understand, like, let's take EKS, like we would look for implementing Cluster API and then see, then with Cluster API, we can launch an EKS cluster in first step and manage that.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months?
AWS is hard, to be honest.
Then take Azure.
And Azure, I would rather see it definitely this year and rather sooner than later this year. 6 months?
Yeah, no.
But this is me without, like, I would like to hear the team there.
No,
no pressure. Yeah.
No. Yeah, it's just like if we start talking with other customers that are heavily relying and have taken a strategic decision on just using AKS and EKS clusters, and obviously we could provide value around Kubernetes and on top of Kubernetes towards them. But yeah, I mean, like it's really hard to keep that conversation going, or when it's time to re-engage, etc. So that's why I'm asking to have at least like, okay, it will come this year, so we can start talking. We can whatever.
Yeah. So I think in product we kind of agreed that this makes sense as our like kind of #1 theme across all parts of product, and that also means that when we are implementing things, we are already, or we should already be thinking about, would this feature that I'm building make sense on a non-giant swarm cluster? Right? Because like no matter how you see it, like with Cluster API, parts of the cluster are non-giant swarm kind of, right? And this would hopefully then also make sense to say, okay, could we combine this with completely non-giant swarm clusters and then provide value on top of that to customers, even without them using our types of clusters. So I think there is some interdependencies, but it kind of made sense for the product to say, okay, this is a good priority because it also pulls the rest of the priorities with it, kind of, or has an impact on the rest of the themes and strategic options that we're kind of spanning out for our future. And on some teams, this has a lower impact, I would say, right? And some teams this might have a bigger impact.
And on AWS, we do have an extra challenge in there because we do have to find a way of making sure that we take the existing customers along the way.
A question, in case we move to Cluster API on AWS and we will from one day decide to not further support our own whatever clusters to save time. Do the customer, they all need to do a real migration again because we can't roll the existing customer?
I think the main thing is you have to be able to upgrade from latest giant swarm to earliest cluster API.
So I think this is the year where we are openly talking about this, and cluster API groups upstream have seen us being involved since like for the last quarter or so.
I can also see cluster API becoming much more of a thing here, right?
Yeah.
Like if you go back a few years, people say like, "Oh, Kubernetes, oh, that's super new," and I could see us having something similar with cluster API, where like, sure, now we might be a bit ahead of the curve with most customers who are like, cluster API, what's that? Whereas like in a few years, I could see people going like, okay, well, we just standardized against cluster API. If you can provide that, great.
So my thought was like, okay, what would be kind of the next big milestone? So in the past, we often set milestones like having the first customer in production on AWS, for example, was at a certain point of time a quarterly theme and milestone we worked towards, and that was helpful. And my picture here is like, obviously, I'd like to see a customer one day that has like whatever 20, 30 EKS or AKS cluster, or maybe GKE cluster even, within their organization, moving that towards us with cluster API, and obviously see the value that we build around Kubernetes and on top of Kubernetes. So that would be kind of an ideal picture for myself. Question is like, obviously that would be nice if that happens within 12 months. Maybe that's unrealistic, but it's something we might be working towards. What do you think about that?
Yeah, maybe some context to that is also because it's kind of on the bylines only. This is super scary, right? I mean, we've been like making money with doing Kubernetes, and now we're doing less Kubernetes, and we need to think about things, how we still provide value, and have maybe in some places less control, which is also super scary then for like, the on-call and the solution engineering side, for example. But I do agree. Having some like an actual outcome set as a goal would be something that we should work towards. We don't have that right now. Right?
Would we go GA on cluster API before it's GA upstream?
Yes.
Okay.
Otherwise, we would be a few years out. Like it's not going to be GA for years.
I can't disagree with this being scary. I think we did this decision already with getting rid of Giant Swarm container as a service. Like we had less control over the actual container orchestrator now because we don't fucking build it anymore. Yeah. It's Kubernetes.
I'm also not so scared. I'm like, if we think about the jobs a customer has to be done, and I think yesterday we quickly discussed about Spot instance, and they are adopting clusters, and they focus on just one single job and doing that extremely well, which is cost optimization. And so there are many more jobs. If you think about running a fleet of clusters, then provisioning and updating and taking care of the customer cluster life cycle. There's so many more jobs they have to focus on, and that's where we need to reinvent ourselves a little bit. That's at least my point.
And that's super exciting, right? That's the other side of it. Like
totally.
Like when you're under this kind of like pressure and fear, it is also exciting because you can finally think about like, cool, I can like what like there is so many things we all have seen. So many things that we could do additionally. Like all the hackathons show extremely cool things that we could do when we have time.
Yeah.
And it's exciting to think about a future where we actually get to do the more exciting stuff and not, oh, we need to do the next Kubernetes again, and then the next Kubernetes, and then the next, and then they're again out with a new version.
I think we simply need to keep that spirit of innovation and reinventing ourselves around what needs to be done and when it's the right time, and being always like 2 years ahead of the general market. Yeah. And then we are fine. I mean, like, we have had that, like if we look back 6 years, we have had that whatever in the first place. We had even own servers. We had own servers in the US and in Europe, and targeted developers, and then we did a kind of a pivot and focused more on enterprises, and we had to, then Kubernetes was becoming more a thing that was not a big thing in the first 2 years of Giant Swarm, and then we adopted Kubernetes, and I see that path, we're just following it. And still, we get always and every day a better understanding of it. At least that's for me true.
Yeah, this is becoming this like every 2-3 years we're reinventing ourselves thing.